This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit. What do you guys want to talk about?
What's up, people? As you can probably tell by today's title, we have a very special podcast in store. I've been waiting with bated breath to talk about this one. All those Crockett TV reviews. And it finally culminates here. A show that receives mixed bag reviews, even to this day. But today's the day where I give you my breakdown. Obviously, I'm referring to Starrcade 1987. And that is merely one of three segments on the agenda, because we also have Mid-South and World Class to talk about. It's my favorite show we run. Some people may like the modern stuff more than the classic stuff, but when it comes to my channel, I really look forward to the Friday shows above anything else. It's hard to find wrestling fans out there anymore that actually value old school wrestling. But for the small minority of those that do, more power to you. I mean, the bulk of them are probably avid watchers of Cornette's podcast every week. Before we dive in anything particular, make sure that y'all subscribe and comment, like the show. Make sure to come back and check us out on YouTube or Rumble each Monday and Friday. We've also got a big Monday podcast coming up, so stay posted for that. This coming weekend, we have 2 Survivor Series recaps we're going to be doing, in addition to Retro NXT, which I'll manage to squeeze in somewhere, somehow. If I manage to somehow survive the WWF pay-per-view, which the jury's still out on that one. As of this recording, I am partially through Survivor Series 94. I think the ugly part is out of the way, but still having nightmares over having relived it. I'll let you all discuss amongst yourselves what you think that might be. But that'll all be for the Monday discussion. Trust me, there's plenty of ugly to talk about with Starrcade 87. Not to say it's all ugly. Just, the vast majority of it. I kid. Don't get your panties in a wad. Anyway, I think I've wasted enough time here. Let's get going with the show. And we are going to start with the main event this time. I'm not milking this one for the final segment. We are jumping in with both feet here. So Starrcade 87. A very surreal show in many ways. This is always going to be one of those events where you're going to get in 2 entirely polar opposite perspectives, depending on who you listen to. You'll get the regular, average, everyday fans that look back on it with fond memories and remember it as one of the hottest periods to be a wrestling fan, where you had Crockett Promotions basically competing and going head-to-head with the WWF. The NWA just bought out the UWF in the spring of 87, so there's a big talent expansion going on. Business at this point, while not as hot or booming as it was in the previous year, they're still selling out arenas. Company morale is pretty high, at least in terms of the on-screen product. Remove some of the managerial stuff that was happening behind closed doors. Like, you watch the TV shows and you think, things don't seem that bleak. Then, of course, you get the historian's perspective where They sort of dignify Starrcade 87 as the beginning of the downturn, so to speak. Wasn't the peak of the downturn, but it definitely helped to facilitate things as we move into 88 and we start to hear about the rumblings of JCP being $2 million in the hole, all that jazz. Now, when it comes to the build for Starrcade 87, I've alluded to a few problems along the way, at least when it comes to the television shows and some of the things that were leading up to the event. We talked about the Ronnie Garvin world title run. He was sort of the paper champion going into the event, but the title reign was a complete disaster. It flopped. Everybody knew it. Most people were just kind of ready to see Flair win the belt back and move past the whole lip service booking that Dusty was doing by putting the belt on Ronnie in the first place. We talked about the UWF talent crossover and the way a lot of the guys were being featured on the Superstation programming. It's a lot of names, but most of them have not been used very effectively. I haven't really talked about the whole controversy surrounding Starrcade 87 and why it leaves a bad taste in so many people's mouths. And I think it's important to understand that from my point of view, I wasn't even born until like a month after the show even aired on pay-per-view. So in all fairness, I don't have the historical perspective of what it was like working for the company at the time, all the business drama going on with the WWF running Survivor Series against that pay-per-view the same night. Vince basically going to all the cable providers and saying, it's us or them. You decide which company is the better long-term asset because you can't carry both on pay-per-view. And because of the massive success of WrestleMania 3 that year, most of the cable providers folded and said, well, you got a point, Vince. Fuck them. They're on their own. And I think most of them bailed out, except for like 3 or 4 of the main ones that actually decided to carry Starrcade. But it totally screwed over Crockett because of all that pay-per-view revenue they missed out on. So I kind of view this event in twofold. It's a show that has several redeeming qualities, even if the booking was all over the map, up and down the card, which we will definitely detail as we run down the show. Or it's a disaster from a business standpoint, and it basically left Crockett to flounder because of all the money they lost by running the event in Chicago and getting fucked over by Vince. It's a whole conglomeration of things if you really think about it. But even when you look back at this event as a whole, and you know, people often refer to Starrcade 87 as the beginning of the end for JCP. To be honest with you, yes, there are definitely a lot of red flags and warning bells that go off as the show progresses. You know, things that happen behind the scenes that basically handcuff the NWA so they never even get out of the starting block. I think it's the aftermath that really gives this pay-per-view a bad reputation. Because there's a lot of horrible shit coming up in 88 that I think a lot of people neglect. Not just business dealings, which are pretty well documented, but I mean, even with the booking side of things, you know, Ronnie Garvin flopping as a main eventer and basically toiling around mid-card purgatory until a disastrous heel turn that goes absolutely nowhere. Nikita getting knocked down the card, like his passion for the business starts to wane. After all that success he brought to the company in mid to late 86 as a babyface single star, main eventing last year's Starrcade with Flair for the world title, by mid 88, the guy's a total afterthought. And as we'll talk about when we get there, there's the whole disaster of a world tag title match with Tully and Arn versus the Road Warriors. I mean, regardless of how good or bad the match was, it's always the finish that leaves a bad taste. And all the ramifications for them running events in Chicago after the fact. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of stuff I'm missing right now, but those are just a few things that stand out to me as I look back at the timeline between November and December of 87 and early to mid 88. like right before the Great American Bash Tour, where things do momentarily pick up for a brief window, but too little too late by that point. And obviously the biggest thing to keep on your radar as we go into 88 is the ongoing beef with the JCP and the WWF running major events head-to-head. Like, Starrcade 87 was only the tip of the iceberg, because then there's the Bunkhouse Stampede going up against the 88 Royal Rumble. Obviously, we're coming up on the first Clash of Champions in March of 88. That goes up against WrestleMania 4. You know, Crockett's continual efforts to compete on big stages with Vince. And while that one actually worked in his favor, as opposed to the Bunkhouse Stampede going up against the Rumble, which was just a total disaster. Again, though, you look at Crockett Promotions, and I don't think they knew it at the time, but the company was still financially in the hole. And I think once we see how the landscape changes as Crockett starts negotiating with Turner for the sale, God, whatever month that comes in, sometime in the fall of 88, you start to look back at everything from the previous year in 87, and you're like, the book kind of starts here with Starrcade. If only we had the vision of foresight to just see how truly bad things were. So with that, now that I've already soured everybody on the pay-per-view, I do want to try and review this event as constructively as I can. And I'm just going to pretend like it's a normal day at the office where I'm watching the event as a fan. It'll be no different from how we review the Saturday syndicated TV shows on TBS. It's been a long time since I've gone back and watched the show. Somewhere in my box of VHS collectibles, I have Starrcade 87 sitting around somewhere collecting dust. Of course, I don't have a VCR anymore, so it's kind of just for show. And we really are going back in a ways. It's been well over 20 years, that's for damn sure. Now, of course, because I'm watching the show on the cock, it's not true to its original form. There's a lot of editing and dubbing going on in here, a lot of music being changed, a lot of things that were cut from the original tape because, well, standards and practices, I guess. WWE wants to avoid those copyright claims. But for those that have been following our review series on the NWA, Crockett Promotions, whatever you want to call it, this event was held at the UIC Pavilion in Chicago, Illinois. The first Starrcade event held outside the Greensboro, Atlanta area. Obviously going back to when the original or the first Starrcade was closed-circuited at both venues. That would have been 85 and 86, I believe. And again, you'll get the historians that complain about the decision to move Starrcade to Chicago, how it was a poor business move, blah, blah. I don't want to bore you to death with all the business ends of things, because that's not really what these retro reviews are designed for. Yes, I want to try and provide context where it's key, but I also never claim to be an expert on any of this stuff, and I'm not going to try to start now. The first official match on the card was the advertised prelim six-man tag of Sting, Michael Hayes, and Jimmy Garvin versus Eddie Gilbert, Rick Steiner, and Larry Zbyszko, accompanied by Baby Doll, which is still a very weird visual to me. I actually deem this match the, fuck it, got a bunch of former UWF guys we need to shoehorn on the card. Put them all in the opening match. And a lot of fans were still filing in when they sounded the bell to start the match. Especially in the lower bowl, there were a lot of empty seats still. Now, of course, you never would have known that, judging how hot the crowd was. I mean, even at, 60% capacity? Still sounded like they were hanging from the rafters. Oh, by the way, I need to mention this before I forget. Great to have Jim Ross back with Tony Schiavone to call the show. He brought so much energy to this thing. Like, this is prime JR, the commentary booth. Super lively, super passionate, great play-by-play analysis. You know, I always talk about how mid to late 80s, late 90s JR, like that ranks among my favorite lead announcers, whether it was Mid-South, WCW, WWF. Can't say it enough, man. Ross was impeccable. Great at his job. And even for such a basic prelim match with a simplistic layout, it was a great showcase for all 6 guys. Everyone played an integral part in the match. There was no odd man out. Like, even for a green guy like Sting, it was the perfect spot for him to be in. Didn't rely on him having to carry the action for the entire 15 minutes. You know, for the moments he wasn't the legal guy, you can see him standing on the apron just absorbing and studying everything going on, learning the psychology and timing and how to milk big moments. You get the baby faces running wild early on. Again, crowds on their feet for virtually every spot. You know, heat on Jimmy Garvin. The Hills are taking their time working him over. Camera guy's doing a great job filming Precious's reaction on the floor. And eventually they had Sting be the first babyface to try to make the comeback, but he ends up getting cut off and worked over for a bit. And again, I have to reiterate what I said a minute ago because it's so imperative. There's no dead weight in this match. Like, even the younger, greener guys like Steiner and Sting, they're still a big part of the action. You know, they're not just in there to hit 1 or 2 spots and then tag back out. Nah, they're in there hanging with the ring veterans. Great utilization of older and younger generational talent. And of course, once you get Hayes making the big babyface comeback, things kind of break down from there. By this point, the story of the match is all centered around the 15-minute time limit. So we're winding down the clock as the pandemonium ramps up. And eventually, with all 6 guys in there, they do a spot where Hayes plants Zbyszko with a running bulldog. Fucking great bump Zbyszko took for that, too. Sold it like $1 million. But of course, he gets his foot on the bottom rope, so the ref waves off the call. And while they're trading some more stuff at the end, Hayes ends up trying to catch Gilbert in a sunset pin attempt. But the time expires before the ref can count the 3. So we end up going to a 15-minute Broadway in the Starrcade opener. Now, of course, if this were 2023, the fans would be chanting bullshit or 5 more minutes. Because modern fans are stupid and they don't understand wrestling psychology. But it worked for everybody involved. No one had to eat a pin. Babyfaces ended up standing tall because the heels all powdered afterwards. Sting looked great in his first major pay-per-view showcase for Crockett Promotions. This is like the perfect pay-per-view opener. I had absolutely no complaints about anything that happened. Again, trying to review this as a fan and not a complete insider mark. But this is the kind of undercard multi-man stuff that would definitely stand out in today's product. If it were booked properly and we only saw multi-mans once in a blue moon. And not every single fucking match on the card with geeks that nobody cares about. Like, the star power in this one match alone, God. It's amazing when you look back at this period and realize most of these guys were main event players by their own right. And they were all curtain jerk in the pay-per-view. Shows how far the business has fallen over time. And then we go from that to Dr. Death Steve Williams versus Barry Windham for the UWF Heavyweight Championship. And again, it's easy enough to concede. The match didn't really have a lot of heat. And, I mean, how much weight did the UWF Heavyweight title really carry by this point in 87? All fair evaluations. And it's definitely one of those bizarre situations where, well, it's a babyface match for one, which you didn't really see all too often, especially on pay-per-view level shows. It's also weird to think that this is what they had Barry Windham doing in 1987 when just as early as the spring and early summer of this year, Barry was like one of the hottest baby faces on Crockett TV, going up against Ric Flair for the World Heavyweight title, main eventing the Crockett Cup, one of the more heavily featured talents on the syndicated programming. Like all the work he was doing with guys like Dusty and Nikita and Ronnie, all the top baby faces. Remember when he was feuding with the Midnight Express at one point? Now here he is in November of the same year, and he's working the second match on the card with Dr. Death for a totally worthless belt. And again, the match didn't really have a lot of heat to it. Fans were actually chanting boring at one point. You could hear pins dropping in the building. And I don't know what you chalk that up to, whether it's a lack of heat, the fact that you really didn't have a definitive guy to cheer for, or what the deal was. By that same token, especially with that popcorn fart of a finish, you can almost kind of see the gears turning in the booking department for where Barry would go in 88. I mean, we've talked about this on the channel, I don't know how many times by now, how much the guy's floundered since the fallout to the Bash Tour, at least from a booking standpoint. Like Barry Windham, he's just been a guy, not really doing a whole lot of substance. Like even as I reflect back on the Saturday shows, I still can't even remember how this match even got booked or announced. I think Barry just kind of mentioned it in a passing promo one week, and it was like, oh, okay. Well, that came out of nowhere, didn't it? By the time it was over, the only thing I could think to myself was, this Barry Windham fella needs to turn heel in the worst way imaginable. Because they about cut his balls out from under him with the way this match ended. Speaking of balls, now they try to work in some angles here to keep it mildly interesting. Barry accidentally headbutted Dr. Death in the groin during a rope running spot. Crowd kind of shat on it because it just ended up grinding the match to a screeching halt. The problem, too, is that the spot didn't really lead to anything, because then they just kept wrestling until Dr. Death dodged a running dive attempt from Barry. And then Barry went sailing out to the floor and took a bump off the timekeeper's table. Flash forward about 30 seconds. Dr. Death just rolls up Barry and pins him. The epitome of flatter than a plate full of piss. The crowd booed the shit out of the finish. And again, it's hard to tell whether that was for Williams going over or if they just thought the finish was so lame. Either way, I can't blame them. I mean, it's hard to judge one way or the other solely based on the discussion of the match having virtually no heat. But again, going back to the booking of Barry Windham, which I didn't finish my thought on, if this was sort of the catalyst that got them thinking, yeah, we maybe need to consider flipping Barry heel to do something different with him because this babyface run is about dead in the water, I wouldn't be shocked. Because for where Barry was in the pecking order at this point, especially coming out of this show, like you'd have thought he'd had both feet out the door getting ready to lead the promotion. Beating him flat like this with a roll-up pin. Second on the card in a total nothing match. It's almost baffling to think this is what they had in mind for Barry going into the event. I mean, luckily things turned around for him shortly. And that takes us to one of the more notorious matches on the 87 Starrcade card. Even with the talent involved, still gets a pretty bad reception all these years later. And I'm obviously referring to the infamous scaffold match between the Midnight Express and the Rock and Roll Express. And of course, the first thing that jumps out for me before we even break down the particulars of what happened in this match, it's a fucking scaffold match. We are told, the most dangerous match in the history of pro wrestling. We're being promised that somebody will either get seriously injured or outright die. Why was this fucking third on the card? The most dangerous match in all of wrestling. It is third on the card, following an opening 6-man tag and an underwhelming title match with no heat. Now, the other issue, and we talked about this during the Crockett TV reviews, how poor the actual build to the scaffold match was, especially in comparison to the previous year's scaffold match with the Road Warriors, where they were shooting angles and pre-tapes and going out of their way to actually sell the stipulation match. I mean, this year the promotion's been mid at best, and it had nowhere near the level of gravity or intensity as the 86 scaffold match. Not even close. Now, we obviously know the chemistry that the Rock and Roll had with the Midnights. So, again, why they felt it necessitated them breaking out the scaffold stipulation here as opposed to just doing a regular tag match, God only knows. Because you clearly understand the shackles that come when you do stipulation matches like this, where it's all built on the drama of seeing somebody take the bump off the structure. Like, you can't do jack shit in these kinds of matches. You can't bump. You can't sell properly. You could barely fucking walk. And because this had nowhere near the level of heat or drama of the previous year's scaffold match, and when Bobby and Stan actually took the scaffold bumps here, they were like popcorn fart reactions in comparison to last year. Now, to be fair, they tried a couple things to attempt to make the match interesting, like the deal with Ricky getting jumped by Big Bubba before the bell, leaving Robert to fend for himself 2-on-1 until Ricky made the save with the racket. They did the powder in the eyes deal at one point to blind the baby faces, which I don't even think actually led to anything, because Ricky and Robert just kept fighting and they ended up no-selling it. They did some pap smear blade jobs, which looked exactly like that. Now, of course, the fans popped when Bobby and Stan took the bumps off the bottom platform, but I mean, again, just I hate to always revert back to that same conversation about comparing this to last year's scaffold match, but how can you not? They're like night and day comparisons. For everything they did right with the Road Warriors match, this one fell short on almost all accounts. God, and I didn't even mention the Bubba stuff. I think this is what set him over the edge and basically ran him out of the fucking company. Because not only do they book him in a lame post match where he gets cock-blocked by Ricky at the top of the scaffold structure, I don't think he got paid for that spot. I mean, if he did get paid, it was for significantly less money than what everybody else made. For a dumb angle, no less. And obviously Jim was there, but he wasn't bumping off the damn thing. Not after last year's debacle. He already had 2 ACL repairs done between then and now. He wasn't about to put himself in an iron lung. Not for this match. It sucks. But I gotta be honest. I'm a big Midnight Express mark. My all-time favorite tag team. I still think this ranks among the worst Midnight Express matches of all time. It's certainly one of my least favorites to go back and watch. It just didn't work. It was a bad idea from the moment it was announced. There was no reason for them to do another one of these matches. Booking-wise, it was a fiasco for all the parties involved. Like, the Midnights are still the U.S. Tag Champions by this point, so them losing here didn't do them any favors. The Rock and Roll Express come out on the better end of the feud, but by the time 88 rolls around, they're getting into all kinds of contractual tie-ups with the office over pay. So they're sort of in and out of the company throughout most of 88. Big Bubba got fucked here for a payout, so he totally gave up trying. Cornette notably looks back at this match with disdain from what I remember. All in all, just not a good match. Bad match, bad idea. Just didn't work. That's really the nice way of me putting it. If I cared to, I could probably go on another 15-minute tirade about it. But for the sake of time, I'll just move on and turn a blind eye. We'll also turn a blind eye to that terrible Dr. Death promo with Bob Caudle, where he promised that he would give between 110 and 210% to keep his UWF title in his possession. Using some of that Steiner math logic, I see. By the way, I'm like 90% sure the UWF title isn't even a thing by January of 88. Could be wrong about that, but I know it eventually gets scrapped. Or they just quietly stop mentioning it on TV. I don't know which. So the next match on the card is the unification match for the UWF and NWA Television Championship. It is Nikita Koloff versus Terry Taylor. Probably one of the better utilizations of UWF versus NWA stipulation matches they came up with. Because at least this one had stakes to determine who the real world's television champion was. Because there can only be one, by cracky. At this point, they removed the scaffold structure from ringside. So now we know why Dr. Death was back there cutting a 5-hour rambling promo minutes ago. You know, it's so weird. This was actually a really good title match when all was said and done. It wasn't a rip snorter. It wasn't a winning match of the year or anything. I have like no memory of this match ever happening. And I have the fucking tape. That's crazy. I mean, I probably watched it as a kid with my brothers, not thinking anything of it. But like I said, this was actually one of the stronger matches on the entire show. And no one ever talks about it. Now, it definitely took a while to get going, because they had a lot of time to fill here. But it was the perfect old school layout for a white-hot fan-favorite babyface going up against the outsider, chicken shit, cowardly heel, so to speak. You get Nikita in there just dominating Terry for like the first 10 minutes. Everything Terry tries, he gets cut off and worked over. It's constant bailing out to the floor. Eddie Gilbert's out there trying to play cheerleader for him. You get the early developments with Taylor getting into the shouting matches with Earl Hebner. Like anytime he tries to do something to cheat behind his back, Hebner's right there to catch him in the act. And he does eventually catch Nikita off guard after he missed a running sickle charge. Terry's able to work him over for the heat. After literally 10 minutes of Nikita working over Terry's arm, now it's the opposite effect. And of course, things escalate as the heels start ramping up the cheating. And the crowd's actually starting to get into the match more, which was definitely not the case early on, where they were just kind of quiet during Nikita's offense. So they did a great job pulling the people in. You had Hebner catching Terry, trying to pin Nikita with his feet on the ropes. Eventually, Terry's got Nikita locked in the figure four, but Eddie ends up pulling on Terry's wrist for leverage. That's some good classic heel shit there. And then we get this awesome finish. After Hebner and Taylor have had their 50th confrontation, Gilbert tries to hit the ring to restrain Nikita. And of course, we've seen this backfire move a million times before for the heels. Nikita dodges, Terry collides with Gilbert, sends him flying off the apron. And then Nikita hits a huge sickle on Terry Taylor. Big fucking pop. 1, 2, 3. Nikita wins both titles. It's the perfect humiliation cap for the bad guys getting their comeuppance. All their attempts at thwarting the babyface in what was essentially a handicap match from start to finish. And it all bombed. You know, the thing that's great is that it actually tied in with the story of Eddie and Terry's syndicated promos. Remember when they kept coming out on television and saying, we're going to work as a tag team and fuck Nikita over? Now, lo and behold, the end result, Nikita outsmarted them both. And he won. Great stuff. And like I said, kind of an undervalued, underappreciated match on the Starrcade 87 card, I think. Because the fans were kind of lukewarm for most of it, right up until the last 5 minutes or so, once the heels started kicking it into a higher gear. And then they came alive for all the stuff at the end. So when people reflect back on the card, I think people ought to be praising for it just how good it was. Again, it wasn't a barn burner or anything like that, but just a very simple, old-school NWA-style title match that kind of gets lost in the weeds when people look back at the show overall. And it's kind of disappointing. It's also disappointing to see what comes of Nikita's run in '88. But again, we'll talk about that in graver detail as we continue with the Crockett TV reviews next year. So that, of course, brings us to the match. The one that forever killed Chicago. It's definitely the match that this pay-per-view is most renowned for. And not in a good way. For the NWA World Tag Team Championships, the challengers Hawk and Animal, the Legion of Doom, going up against the champions Tully and Arn of the Horsemen. And it is important to note, the Road Warriors were both from Chicago, so they were the hometown babyfaces going in. Hence my reference to the killing of Chicago by the time we got to the actual finish. And we will definitely break down that all-time clunker of a call. When it comes to the actual match, if you've seen any of my Road Warriors match reviews in the last couple of years on the channel, whether they were facing the Midnight Express, the Russians, any combination of random job guys on the Superstation, doesn't matter who they were paired up against, it's the same principle. They go in there and basically dominate the entire match. You get Tully and Arn bumping around like pinballs the entire time. I mean, layout-wise, it was very similar to the matches we saw with the Midnight Express from the previous year. Now, they did let Arn and Tully get a little bit of heat by working over Hawk's leg. But we know the Road Warriors never got over by being the babyfaces in peril, so it didn't last all that long. They're not a Ricky and Robert type tag team where they can sell the emotion and get the fans to rally behind them to make the comeback. So, I mean, when you kind of analyze everything in short, it's Tully and Arn getting ragdolled and thrown around almost the entire time. A little bit of heat on Hawk before the Animal comeback. And then you get everything leading up to the Dusty finish, which is kind of where things go haywire. In this particular Dusty finish, we've seen it a million times before. It's the deal where you get the ref bump out to the floor, and while all four guys are in the ring brawling, something happens to where the heel gets dumped over the top rope, and the ref is able to catch it peripherally, but he doesn't immediately call for the disqualification. So while the babyfaces are still making the comeback and setting up their finish, they get the visual pin because a second referee runs down to count the fall, and then they do the whole reversal decision, boo, fuck you, fans boo kind of thing. Again, it's been done countless times before. Here's the dilemma. You're in Chicago. The Road Warriors at this point are still white-hot babyfaces. Up to this point, the company's gone above and beyond to protect those guys at every turn. And even if Dusty never wanted to put the belts on them, you know, the logic being, well, I mean, you put the titles on them, how do you get them off? I get it. But you know what? If that's the case, then why book the fucking match? This did such astronomical damage to where not only did it kill the Chicago crowd by them not putting the straps on the Road Warriors, but it totally derailed them afterwards. Because they were never the same after this loss. DQ or not, the mystique was gone. You just cut their balls out from under them. And it wasn't the good kind of heat response when the fans booed at the end. That was disgust heat. That was fuck you, Crockett Promotions, for stiff-arming us kind of heat. Which is not good. They didn't turn on Tully and Arn. They turned on the company. They turned on the booking. And again, I get the argument. You put the straps on them. You don't really have a way of getting the belts off of them unless you do some kind of fucked finish later on, which would kind of just get you the same result. But there wasn't a single person in the world that could defend this. God, them sending out poor fucking Magnum TA afterwards to try to defend it. It was such BS. And everybody knew it. It's not just the here and now ramifications for the bad booking decision. It's the aftermath that really stings. Yeah, the Road Warriors would still be over to an extent. But it just wasn't the same, man. You were in Chicago. You knew the fans were not going to accept any other decision. Why not just go there? Even if you make the title reign short, have them drop the belts in a month or two, at least you wouldn't have killed the hometown crowd. You know, at least you wouldn't have run off your entire Chicago market in one fell swoop. Because that's all this accomplished. And I can't even really judge whether or not the action was good, because it really doesn't matter at the end of the day, does it? The only thing people ever talk about when it comes to this match is the bad finish. And that really is kind of where the conversation starts and ends. Unfortunately. And this is still when they had 2 more big featured matches to get through on the card. As you'll see, it didn't do Flair, Garvin, Luger, or Rhodes any favors. Which takes us to the cage match. For the U.S. Heavyweight title, Dusty Rhodes versus Lex Luger. Also a career versus title stipulation being added, to where if Dusty loses, he must leave JCP for 90 days. Which we've covered in the NWA TV reviews. I mean, they definitely devoted a lot of time and attention to this in the build-up. I just wish the execution wasn't so narcotic. I can probably count on one hand the amount of NWA matches that I've legitimately fallen asleep during. This happened to rank among the few. And it's not even to really say it was bad. Again, the problem is you're coming fresh off that World Tag title match where the fans totally shit on the finish. And now you follow that with Dusty and Luger in a cage where they're practically laying there on the mat and hammerlock holds for 80% of it. I mean, they didn't even really use the cage as a weapon. I mean, Dusty got juice later on when Luger was working him over, but it was more like a paper cut over the eyebrow more than anything. Again, factoring in all the stipulations and all the hype that went into this match, kind of an underwhelming payoff. I mean, the finish was definitely the most notable takeaway. I just don't think the finish was ever in doubt for a lot of people and who was going over. On the one hand, it's Luger's first Starrcade event, and it's a pretty big spot for him to be in. Going up against Dusty in the semi-main for the U.S. Heavyweight title, where he's the defending champion. But come on. Did anybody really think for like a split second that Luger was winning this match? Give me a break. Of course, the deal at the end, JJ finally lays out Johnny Weaver on the floor, the assigned gatekeeper for the cage. And that was merely a distraction tactic so JJ could grab the key and pretend he was going to unlock the cage door. Meanwhile, that left enough time for Luger to chop block Hebner from behind. That way JJ could toss the chair in over the cage. A feat of strength if I've ever seen it. Poor out-of-shape JJ trying to heave this folding chair 15 feet over the top of the cage. You had never seen a man struggle so much. And then there's the actual chair spot. which is just kind of... No joke. This is the spot. Luger leans over to grab the chair. Dusty DDTs him on the chair. 1, 2, 3. That was the spot. That was the collective amount of effort that went into putting that together. I don't know. Part of it was Dusty probably trying to idiot-proof the match. Because he knew Luger wasn't a great technician. Probably wanted to make sure it didn't get too busy in there. That's understandable. And it didn't hurt Luger by doing the job. Because we obviously know what's in store for him in '88 when the Horsemen split and we get the eventual rise of his babyface singles run. Not to play spoiler, but I think most people out there know about that. But as a smart fan, I don't know, you kind of look back at it and you're like, yep, typical Dusty finish right there. Putting himself over and making it all about him. I mean, it was an okay match. Definitely not one of those all-time Starrcade classics you need to go out of your way to see. I mean, it did temporarily give the fans a chance to take their minds off the previous match, so I guess that counts for something. I always think back to this cage match, though, and the finish is always the thing that remains the standout about it. And as I went back to watch the match again, I'm like, maybe there will be a couple things in this match that refresh my memory, and reliving it again? Nah. It's the same deal. I only remember the finish. Dusty wins the blow-off. It's kind of the headline of the entire segment. But we have one more match to discuss on this event. And it is indeed the main event for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship in a cage rematch of sorts. Going back to where we all started in Detroit some odd months ago. It's jean-wearing, pickup truck-loving, mid-card world champion Ron Garvin defending against the Nature Boy Ric Flair. A title reign that could use its own thesis paper on why it was doomed to fail. Some of which we've discussed on the channel when they actually aired the initial footage. And in fact, if you'll recall, when we actually saw that footage for the first time, I defended it. Even if I was sort of in agreement with a lot of critics out there that the title reign was a complete disaster and didn't really do the company any favors, I thought the title switch was kind of needed to sort of pay off that long-term Garvin Flair program that had been going on for 2 years. But again, in what was already a relative down period for the NWA product in the fall of '87, switching the belt onto Ronnie Garvin as a courtesy favor from Dusty. I mean, you were only going to get so much of a return on that investment. And I think the Chicago crowd's reaction to Ronnie was pretty telling. I mean, to say these fans were very anti-Ron Garvin, that'd probably be underselling it considerably. I mean, it wasn't even like an 80-20 split in terms of fans favoring Flair over Garvin. It was like 95-5. Maybe even 99-1. The one singular elderly woman in the nosebleeds of the building, faintly chanting for Ronnie's name. You could hear the echoes from a great distance. And again, it's really unfortunate. Because Garvin and Flair had great chemistry together. And they had, some like 50 matches prior to this one. They knew the exact kind of match they were going to do. They'd done it 1,000 times before. The ring psychology was just totally out of whack because nobody saw Ronnie as the babyface. And even though nobody ever really talks about this match in great detail, it really was a very good cage match, all things considered. I think the Detroit match is always more memorable because of the actual title change. This one was just kind of seen as the rematch where they flipped the belt back onto Flair, and almost kind of quietly pretended the whole Ronnie title reign never happened. Because, God, did they throw that under the bus quickly thereafter. But it had all the usual Garvin Flair tropes. Chop Fest City. Of course, you knew Flair was going to bleed at some point. That's usually a foregone conclusion in big settings like this. I will say, they definitely did a better job utilizing the cage as a weapon here, unlike Dusty and Luger in the previous bout. But they were definitely laying it in, more than usual. I like the little ode to their match in Detroit where Garvin went up top to hit the sunset, but Flair actually had it scouted this time. So when he went to grab the ropes and Tommy Young kicked Flair's hands off, the fans actually popped because they thought it was going to be the finish. It definitely broke down into one of those pinfall highlight reels, which is kind of what modern wrestling becomes notorious for in a lot of cases, where it's just an endless cycle of big move, kick out, big move, kick out, and they kind of just spam that formula over and over again. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but if you're going to do it, at least save it for the actual stars in the main event. And the whole spot where they tributed their cage match back in September was cool because it led to the ref bump in the corner where Garvin was able to catch Flair with a knockout punch. And after Flair kicks out of that, they end up doing a deal where Garvin comes charging at Flair off the ropes, but Flair ducks it and sends Garvin face first into the cage. And as Garvin bounces off and collides with the mat, Flair's able to stack him up for the quote-unquote shocking upset win, as Tony referred to it as. Shocking? Upset? Not so much. Maybe for the 3 or 4 Ronnie Garvin fans in the crowd. But when Flair got the W at the end, and the people cheered him like he was a fucking saint, like I said, it was actually a very good match. Probably one of the greater dark horse matches of the year 1987. Unfortunately, nobody ever remembers because of the stench of the overall pay-per-view and all the bad feelings surrounding it. Sort of the theme of Starrcade 87. As you look back on the card, to be honest, there were only maybe 1 or 2 clunkers that I can think of off the top of my head. The Road Warriors now winning the belts in Chicago, and the scaffold match, which was just a total financial disaster all around. Take those out, though. The opening 6-man was a lot of fun. Barry Windham and Dr. Death. Granted, while the match was kind of lame, it wasn't a bad match. Fans just didn't care about it because it was a babyface match, so they didn't really have anybody to cheer for. Nikita and Terry for the TV title, that ended up being really fine by the end. Dusty and Luger for the U.S. title had a satisfying payoff, even if the match wasn't anything to write home about. And then you had Flair and Garvin in the main event, which was a very good title match. Even the actual Road Warriors Tully and Arn match itself was enjoyable, if you just remove everything about the fucked finish. Like, I don't know. I'm so conflicted when I look back at this show. Like, on the one hand, I completely understand the hates it gets from all the hardcores, even the knowledgeable historians that talk about the business side of things and how the event was a major flop financially, because in many ways it was. Like, again, we talk about the pay-per-view revenue they missed out on by getting stiffed by Vince and the cable providers. But if you're just trying to evaluate things by removing the business end and focusing strictly on what I think a lot of modern fans would coin the work rate, there's definitely more upside than downside here. Obviously, we're progressing in the NWA timeline, so we were going to wind up talking about Starrcade 87 regardless, even if it's not viewed as one of the better Starrcade events of all time. But I think it's important for people to understand the short-term and the long-term implications for this event. And it is definitely a divisive pay-per-view. And if you've never seen the event and you're wondering, well, is it worth going out of my way to see? I would say Check out the cage match with Flair and Garvin, most definitely. I think that match is criminally underrated in the grand scheme of things. Maybe check out Nikita Koloff and Terry Taylor for the TV titles if you want to see how skilled ring veterans are capable of taking apathetic crowds and getting them to actually care about matches by the end. Because they were definitely working some magic there. Elsewise, if you like train wreck moments in wrestling, you could probably check out the Road Warriors Tully and Arn match just to see the crowd shit on the finish and turn on the company in one night. But, yeah, that was Starrcade 87. And now it is onward and forward as we move into December of 87 and then prepare for the exciting new year in Crockett Promotions. Also the last year of Crockett Promotions before the Turner sale and the rebrand. And all the fun, wonderful pleasures that lay ahead of us. So Mid-South Television's been pretty story-heavy over the last few weeks. Last week, if I recall, they devoted almost the entire first half of the show just to recap content. So I figured this week they were going to be a little more wrestling-heavy. And boy, were they. Even Bill Watts is like, no talk, must go to the ring. Colonel Buck Robley and Mr. Wrestling 2 are waiting for action. The only thing I will note here with Boyd Pierce and Bill Watts, aside from Boyd going back to the well with the flamboyant apparel, it's a subtle thing. But as Boyd's running down the card, he mentions that Stagger Lee will be in action this week. And if you watch Bill, you can see him casually crack a smile. Because he knows what's going on here. It's just something I picked up on. I'm always looking for those subtle nuances. So the TV opener is Robley and Wrestling 2 versus the Grappler and Kelly Kiniski. Guess we're just back to one Grappler, as the other one decided to take a powder. And the story of this match was everything surrounding the controversy of last week's Wrestling 2 segment, where, if you recall, he wrestled a TV match with green splotches all over his mask. Someone had vandalized his property, defamed the mask of Mr. Wrestling 2. So, after 2 and Robley win the match, you get Reeser Bowden calling him over to ringside so he can try to get to the bottom of what's going on. In addition to the mask being destroyed, Wrestling 2 also received a threat of sorts. By that, basically someone just took a sheet of printer paper and wrote, "This is just the beginning." This is great. You know, Wrestling 2's talking about how he's a quiet man, a very reserved man, but this is beyond whatever it may be. Now, for those of you wondering, yes, that was a quote. These death threats are beyond whatever they may be. Well, if they may. So yeah, not a great promo from Wrestling 2 here, but he assured us that he would figure out who is stalking him. So we will see where this Scooby-Doo mystery takes us in the coming weeks. After that, they showed a quick highlight reel of the Tony Atlas Hacksaw Duggan segment from the other week. The one where Duggan tried to challenge Atlas to a push-up contest and utterly failed. And of course, that was only one piece of the overall pie, because the bigger story to come out of it was the fact that after Duggan tried to spear Atlas, but failed to take him down, it busted open Duggan's forehead during the collision spot. And then Duggan went out and wrestled with his head bandaged up less than 15 minutes later. So it's one of those great angles in wrestling where you have both sides actually coming out on the better end, because the fans get a little chuckle out of seeing the heel get debased at his own game, likewise, you turn around and have Duggan get some of his heat back later on by going out there and pummeling some underneath scrub in like 90 seconds. That is what you call efficient booking. And then going back to the ring, we get Marty Lundy in his amateur singlet versus Tony Atlas. Again, I reiterate everything I said last week. Double A in a wrestling singlet. Not a good look. Here's what I got out of the match. If you took these exact same guys and paired them together against each other in the year 1984, it would have been 1,000 times better than this. Because that would have meant Arn was leading the charge. Unfortunately, this is not the Arn Anderson of the Mid-Atlantic Crockett Promotion years quite yet. This was super green, barely knowing shit from apple butter about what he was doing in the ring, Arn Anderson. And Tony Atlas wasn't Ricky Steamboat by that matter. So putting him in charge as the ringleader, not doing anybody any favors. The match is fucking atrocious. Looked like a double amputee wrestling a blind man with all the bumbling and fumbling going on in there. This is now the second time in the last month and a half where I have seen the botched Irish whip spot into the corner where they try the reversal deal and both guys just sort of bump into each other. I'm pretty sure Tony was gassed like a minute in. Lundy had no idea what he was doing. Just a total train wreck of a match. And finally, Atlas had enough strength to pick up Lundy and press slam him for the 3 count. Love me some Double A. This was not one of his finer career moments. Then we came back for Hacksaw Duggan versus Ted Allen, where Bill Watts makes sure to remind us that Duggan is spelled with 2 G's. Not really sure why he felt the need to clarify that, but maybe he was just trying to make for casual conversation. Try to break the ice, if you will. Not quite the same onslaught as last week's Duggan match where he just went out there and saw red. Killed a guy in like a minute flat. This was more of Duggan kind of playing with his food and doing the methodical beatdown. They gave Allen a brief, and I mean very brief flash of offense at the end. After Duggan missed a running charge in the corner and posted himself, Allen got like 2 clean shots in, whipped Duggan to the other corner, and then Duggan just fired back and killed him with a spear. And they actually got the crowd with that too, because you could hear them come alive for that split second. It's kind of like when the hometown sports team is about to score a goal, then they get robbed at the last minute, and it just totally takes the air out of the room. That's what it was like as Ted Allen got cut off by Hacksaw Duggan at the finish of this match. They were so bummed. Then we had Kamala squashing Joe Gaines in a quick match. Not much to really say about that one. They're still playing up the mystery of Kamala's gimmick, speculating over who was pulling the strings and whether or not Kamala is working for a specific party. And they're just kind of taking their time drawing the story out, which is good, because at least it gives Kamala some story direction as opposed to just having him go out there and work horrible 30-second squashes every week. I mean, let's be blunt. Take away any story implication, that's basically what you're dealing with. And then we pick the action back up with Chavo Guerrero and Tony Anthony. Second week in a row we're seeing Chavo in action. He had a really good showing last week, winning the fans over by bringing some of that Mexican heritage to the Mid-South region and working a style that I think a lot of those fans were not used to seeing at the time. This week it was kind of an extension to that same idea. Watts spent most of the match putting over all the unique holds and stretches that Chavo kept applying. It was funny. him encouraging all the aspiring young wrestlers to go put their siblings in surfboard holds. Just think back to all those WWF infomercials where they're telling kids, don't try this at home. And here's Bill Watts in 1982 saying, fuck it. Go in the living room, put your younger brother in a surfboard stretch until he squeals. Y'all need to ruffle some feathers and get beat up once in a while in your life. I liked Watts' approach a lot more. And the finish is great too. A little weird in the timing of the execution, but I mean, it still worked for the crowd. You get Chavo dumping Tony out to the floor, and he's teasing that he's about to do a big dive. But when Tony turns his back, Chavo does the old 619 through the ropes. Right as Tony turns around, that's when Chavo gives him the big diving plancha. But it was kind of choppy in the execution of the spot, because while you got Chavo going around his elbow to get to his wrist, just to set up this dive spot, there's Tony out on the floor, literally just standing there looking at him for like a good 15 seconds. Could have easily just said, fuck no. I'll just move to the side and let this guy come crashing down to the concrete. But instead, Tony had to stand there waiting for Chavo to do all these fancy tricks and then catching him on the dive. And of course, flash ahead a minute later, Chavo gives Tony the bridging suplex off the ropes with a 3 count. Big pop. And again, the Mid-South crowd is digging Chavo Guerrero. They weren't accustomed to seeing this kind of high-flying action as frequently. So you get a guy like Chavo showing up and doing the opposite of what a lot of the big guys were doing at the time. It stands out. Now, of course, the caveat is you having one guy on the roster that does this kind of stuff on TV, as opposed to like 90% of the goddamn roster. Yeah, AEW is still trying to figure that one out. So then we come back for more story development, centering around the Stagger Lee Rat Pack beef. Again, the stipulation to the original Mid-South tag title match was that the loser of the fall had to leave the territory for 90 days. And since JYD took the fall, he is technically, under contractual ruling, intended to be gone from Mid-South. But, well, since DiBiase and Bourne are convinced that Stagger Lee and Junkyard Dog are the same person, they now must prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are the same guy. But they only have 90 days to do it. And we're about a month in from the original date of that Mid-South tag title match. So time's ticking away for the Rat Pack here. They also showed the footage from last week where Bourne and DiBiase unmasked the decoy Stagger Lee, but then they got run off by the actual Stagger Lee. And that all tied in with the next match on the card. Vladik Smirnoff versus what is presumed to be the legit OG Stagger Lee. And after watching this go down, I think we can pretty much confirm they have already given up on the Vladik Smirnoff push. That dude got beat, buried, homogenized, pasteurized, and sodomized. Not necessarily in that order. Seriously, Lee just killed this guy in like a minute flat. I don't think Smirnoff got anything in offensively. Just a complete one-sided annihilation. So whatever Skandar Akbar was trying to do by building up his version of the Russian assassin, he's probably going to have to wait for Nikolai Volkov to show up now. Actually, was Nikolai a member of Devastation Inc.? I know he comes into the territory pretty soon, but can't remember if he was ever part of that stable or not. Maybe I'm thinking of a different Russian. It wasn't Ivan. Crusher Darso, maybe I'm thinking of? Can't remember. My timeline's all mixed up right now. I think I'm confusing shit from 83 and 84, trying to mingle them together. Don't mind me. And for our TV main event, it's Ted DiBiase and Matt Bourne in a non-title tag match with Tim Horner and King Cobra, which is a pretty fun little match while it lasted. Definitely one of those get your shit in type matches where you could tell they were really rushed for time. So everyone's just kind of bam, 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 move, 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 spot, spot, spot the entire time. Not a whole lot of margin for error. They did draw attention to the no moves off the top rope rule. Alfred Neely almost disqualified Matt Bourne for coming off with an axe handle at one point. Not really sure if that was done for story purposes or if Matt Bourne got a little excited there, but it was good attention to detail. In any case, pretty cut and dry formula. Babyfaces got to run wild early on. Heels are playing defense and looking for any opportunity to cut them off. They end up isolating Cobra for a while until Horner makes the comeback at the end. And a minute or two later, DiBiase ducks a dropkick attempt and kills Horner with a lariat. And then Bourne's able to put him away with a power slam. I did like the photo finish booking there, where Watts is counting down the remaining TV time, and the heels managed to squeeze in that win with just a few seconds left. It's one of those elements that's missing in wrestling today that I wish they would bring back. Problem is now because everything is so scripted and overly formatted with television, WWE and AEW don't even conceive of ideas like that anymore. I mean, you never watch a Raw or a SmackDown or a Dynamite anymore and think, man, I wonder if they're going to have enough time to get a clean finish in there before time runs out. Unless you're recording on your DVR and the show feed cuts out at the last second because they can't manage their time properly. And in that case, we mock them for amateur hour. In any case, good stuff at the end there. Not a great episode of Mid-South or anything, but yeah, they moved things along and touched on all the hot programs, which is exactly what needed to happen. A lot of ring action this week, and I imagine that formula will carry over into next week's taping as well. We're coming up on a pretty big couple of years for the Mid-South territory, what many consider to be the boom period for Mid-South. My favorite years to relive, no question. 83, 84, bits and pieces of 85. I mean, it'll be a good contrast to what's coming up in the next few years with World Class and Mid-Atlantic / Crockett Promotions. I mean, in one case, we're effectively seeing a territory grow and expand in popularity. On the other hand, you got two promotions that are slowly dwindling in popularity. Obviously, link that with financial hardship. But it's all part of the journey with these classic reviews. Lots of ups and downs and peaks and valleys and plenty of good and bad to come. Gosh, I just realized that there's only like 8 weeks left for World Class in 84. Doesn't seem that long ago. We were just talking about the year 1983. Now we're closing in on the end of 84. And there's only a handful of things I vaguely remember about World Class in 1985. Most of it involves the Midnight Express. So 85 is going to be a very interesting year for the channel. And on the subject of interesting, this episode of World Class was just that. We got an unexpected Ric Flair appearance on this week's program, which was kind of cool. Good to see the Nature Boy back in Dallas for a very fascinating title defense. Before we get too antsy, though, and jump past the first 3 quarters of the show, let's talk about the opening bout this week. It is the Iceman versus Kelly Kiniski. And to add a little wrinkle into the fold, we also had Jake the Snake Roberts in Kiniski's corner. According to Mercer, Roberts had taken it upon himself to train/tutor Kelly Kiniski because, well, I believe the explanation was Jake saw potential in Kelly Kiniski and he thought he could offer him some veteran advice. Jake was a very patient man. It is kind of funny if you think about that in context for 2023. In 1984, Jake Roberts was a cornerman/manager for one of the underneath guys in Dallas. In 2023, a few gray hairs later, Jake Roberts is still managing underneath guys in AEW. At least I think he still is. Hard to tell because the guy rarely ever shows up on TV. And he's only had like 75 people he's rotated around with on the roster. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Am I right? This is great, though. They're having the match. For what it's worth, it's not terrible. It's a Kelly Kiniski match, though, so the compliments are rail thin. But right at the tail end, Jake grabs a hold of the Iceman's ankle and trips him up. So while Bronco is admonishing him, Kiniski throws the Iceman over the top rope to the floor, which would have been grounds for a DQ had Bronco seen it. But of course, Kiniski is a fucking idiot. So rather him staying on the offensive, he turns his back to look at Jake and give the old well done symbol to pat himself on the back for doing a sleazy underhanded move. He was so proud of himself. So naturally, the Iceman just crawls back into the ring and stacks up Kiniski to pin him. Could you have made that guy look any more moronic? Now, granted, the heels did momentarily get their heat back by stomping a mud hole in the Iceman. I just thought it was so amazing. Seeing Kiniski actually do something pretty crafty, but then he has to turn to his manager and say, "Did I do good, coach?" And meanwhile, Jake's trying to alert him, "Dude, behind you, the Iceman cometh." Too little, too late for dumbass Kelly. So we'll see where that pairing goes. A lot of it screams, we have no idea what to do with Jake Roberts right now, so here, go be a mouthpiece/mentor for Kelly Kiniski. That'll get you some longevity out of your career. We'll see where it takes him. My guess is nowhere fast. And up next, we had a fun little tag team showcase for the Fantastics. They wrestled El Diablo Grande and Dale Weasel. Of course, the thing that always stands out with Fantastics matches are the loud, piercing screams of all the ladies. All Tommy Rogers and Bobby Fulton never have to do are apply headlock takeovers. The girls immediately cream themselves. I'll talk about this all-time classic finish in a minute. Overall, it's a basic enhancement match to highlight the Fantastics. They're over in Dallas. That was pretty well established from the moment they showed up. It wasn't necessarily a squash match, because they did let Diablo and Weasel get a little bit of heat on Tommy right before the comeback. It's the usual babyface flurry you come to expect from Tommy and Bobby. There was a brilliant miscue spot at one point where Bobby Fulton went to throw a dropkick to Diablo during a rope running deal. Not only did Diablo completely no-sell it, but the camera was in perfect position to catch Bobby throwing the dropkick directly at the guy's junk. I have no idea how Diablo didn't drop in a heap. He must have had grand balls of steel. But the finish is marvelous. Okay, so Tommy's in there getting double teamed in the corner. Bobby's watching this all go down from the other side of the ring. So finally he says, fuck this. And he goes in there. He gives Tommy Rogers a full extended hip toss back over to his corner so he can then tag himself in and start making the comeback. In any other rational, sane universe, I would immediately call bullshit on this. But the reaction this spot got from the fans when Bobby Fulton hip tossed his own tag team partner just to tag in and make the comeback. Electric. The things you could get away with back in the day. So, of course, about a minute later, Bobby hits the power slam on Diesel and then tags Tommy in so he can hit a big splash for the 3 count. I mean, at this point, Tommy wasn't even bothering to sell the hip toss he just got from his own partner like a minute ago. Now, he's magically 100% again. It does defy all logic if you think about it for more than 2 minutes. Why would the official allow that to be a legal tag? When he blatantly saw a guy jump into the ring, throw his own partner back to his corner so he could tag himself in, essentially. Why would that be permitted? I don't know. It's stupid. But again, it worked for the crowd, so I'll let it slide. I mean, it's the fucking Fantastics we're talking about here, and they're not some Ham and Egger jabroni duo. Got to cut him a little bit of slack. You know who I won't give slack for? It was Jake Roberts versus Buck Zumhoff. Because their match was booty. More accurately speaking, Buck Zumhoff was booty in this match. I actually wrote this down as a joke, but the more I think back to it, it is legitimately what happened. Zumhoff has Roberts in a headlock, and I think he was supposed to be cranking on Jake's neck to apply more pressure to the hold. I was not entirely convinced he wasn't giving Jake a chiropractic adjustment. He's just slowly moving his neck around in a circle, almost like he was trying to loosen his muscles up. I'm watching him, I'm like, what the fuck is this guy doing? The only other thing I wrote down here was the questionable anticlimactic finish. And again, I am not making this up. This is the actual conclusion to this match. Jake picks up Buck. He drapes him stomach first over the top rope. And Jake pauses. He looks down at Buck Zumhoff's limp body. And then he just pins him. I was like, was that the planned finish? That was your idea? To have Jake drop the guy rib first over the top rope and then just pin him? Okay. I mean, Zumhoff was selling after the bell, so I'm assuming that was not an audible called. But it was such an out-of-nowhere conclusion. I mean, I guess I shouldn't complain too much. I'd rather watch 2 minutes of a Buck Zumhoff match as opposed to fucking 10. All in all, though, it was merely a warm-up to the actual TV main event this week. A very special NWA World Heavyweight Championship match. Chris Adams challenging the defending champion, the Nature Boy Ric Flair. A very unique circumstance, too, where you almost had two quasi-heels going at it here, which always makes for an entertaining matchup, because then the whole thing becomes about one-upsmanship and both heels trying to out-douche the other. Now, keep in mind, Chris Adams is coming off the recent heel turn. Plus, they just shot that heavy heat angle the other week where he basically put Kevin into a coma with that chair shot. So, these people wouldn't have pissed on him if he were on fire. Likewise, you get Ric Flair coming into the Dallas territory. I don't think he was a babyface in '84. God. Him standing across the ring from Chris Adams here. He may as well have been Kerry or Kevin. These people were firmly behind the Nature Boy this week. And it's always such a weird visual for me when I think about the psychology of Ric Flair matches. Watching him work as the babyface in peril. Like, Flair's actually really good at selling. But when you got Adams working him over on the mat, and they do all the close-ups to show Ric Flair in pain, I don't know. It's odd. I guess it stems from all the Crockett reviews we've done in the last couple years. Heel Flair. It's always so much easier to digest than babyface Flair. Not to take anything away from the match here. It's a fucking Ric Flair match. The dude could wrestle a broomstick and it would still be a 3 1/4 starter match in most instances. Nah, he and Adams had great chemistry together. He had a simple story where Adams was working over Flair's arm, trying to weaken the body limb. I did like seeing Flair break out the airplane spin to circumvent a standing hammerlock at one point. Good stuff at the end where they're going back and forth and trading big spots. They do the temporary ref bump where Flair hits a crossbody dive and accidentally falls on top of him. A couple nice flash pin sequences at the end. And it culminates where Flair catches Adams in a double-leg Boston Crab. And Gary Hart, seeing that Adams is on the verge of tapping out, hits the ring and attacks Ric Flair with the shoe. It's interesting how Flair didn't even have to apply the figure 4. When Gary Hart looked and saw Flair put the Boston Crab on Chris Adams, he said, "This is where I must step in." While I am sporting my signature off-the-rack discounted Cole sweater. I did not expect them to end the show with the heel standing over Flair, though. That was a nice surprise. No running from the Von Erichs or anything. None of the locker room babyfaces came out for that matter. They let Adams and Hart stand tall. Flair was down selling as they rolled to the end credits. It's not too often you see a Dallas show end with the heels getting the last laugh. Much less with it being over the NWA World Champion. But that's really going above and beyond to protect Chris Adams as their top heel. Which he definitely needs to be. Again, considering that ongoing beef with Kevin. So this is all good. So far, he's making the most out of this new heel run. I love the new persona. I love the pairing with Gary Hart. Again, I keep talking about it, but it's the best call they could have made for Chris here from a booking standpoint. He ran the gauntlet as a babyface. It was time for a change of pace. And so far, he's taken the ball and run with it. So good on him. And as for next week, I believe it is their special Thanksgiving Star Wars edition. So we'll be seeing the first set of tapings that aired for that event. And they usually book some higher profile matches on those Star Wars shows. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what the card shapes up to be there. And before you know it, we'll be arriving at the Christmas special in December. Just rapidly moving to the tape library, one step at a time. Sometimes it seems like a little bit of a trudge. especially when there's not a whole lot going on with a particular episode. But I'll say this. World Class has seemed to have temporarily found its footing in the last couple of months. You know, there was a long stretch from like the early summer to the mid-fall where there was just nothing happening on this show. Booking was all over the map. It was just kind of rehashing the same old tired ideas over and over again. Fucking Missing Link and Killer Khan main eventing every goddamn show for like 5 months in a row. Stinking up the joint. Now, thankfully, they've gone in a different direction. And with the Midnight's debut shortly around the corner, there's a handful of big things to look forward to in 85. So we'll see how long that gravy train lasts. But as we wrap up this show and prepare for the upcoming weekend monstrosities, that's definitely a term. Just give you the brief overview one more time so you know what's in store. We'll be doing Survivor Series 94. We will be doing the WWE Survivor Series special, which was happening on, I think, Saturday. And then we'll kind of round everything out with the Retro NXT report. No SmackDown, no Retro Raw. But we'll resume with the normal Monday schedule the week afterwards. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Again, make sure you subscribe, comment, like the show for me. And catch you guys soon. Thanks for stopping in. Take care. Peace out.